It really is a real pleasure to be here. For a while it looked touch and go, and I didn't know about the sing-song option. I was thinking of me sitting in the departure lounge at Logan, FaceTiming you guys, and it was not going to be good. It's a real pleasure and a real honor to be here, a real honor to be giving the Paul D. Bartlett Senior lecture. I really appreciate the invitation. And I'm not blaming you for my misery this afternoon. So, what Darwin didn't know. Darwin knew a lot of things, and I'm going to give you the punchline right away. It's actually absolutely remarkable, and my science, evolutionary biology, I think differs from all other sciences in this regard, that our founding father, our parent, Charles Darwin, has remained completely apposite, completely on point, so to speak, despite everything, and enormous advances have been made in biology. That's the message. He wrote a book, 158 years ago, on the origin of species. I still have my students this is not a history of science class, this is an evolutionary biology course. I have them read The Origin of Species, partly because they get to see how to construct an elegant, powerful, effective argument, but also because there's so much really great science. And that it's not like it's become dusty and Victorian, the science that Darwin is discussing in The Origin. That science remains today vital, important, and interesting. So that's the punchline. Darwin's still hot as hell, okay? But having got the punchline, we'll now sort of back up and we'll get there. So, and I think it's really remarkable that he devised an idea. He wrote this great book, which is robust to all the developments that have happened since. And I'm a biologist, so I'm biased. But man, what a lot has happened over those 150 plus years, right? And yet, because he stuck to what he knew and that he was confident in, he stuck to his facts. He didn't go overboard with his speculation. What we have is something which is completely robust to this day. That virtually every word in that book is still as true today as it was when he wrote it. But what I'm talking about are the things he didn't know. Okay, and of course there were lots of critical things. And I obviously don't have time. I only have 45 minutes. I begged and wheedled. Give me 3 hours, I said. No, they said, secretly hoping that my flight would be even more delayed. So what I'm going to do is, I'm actually only going to highlight 2 of these topics, but I do just want to give you a very brief sense of some of the key things that have happened since. A huge one is this one. Here's Gregor Mendel. Natural selection is an explicitly genetic theory. It's about the preferential survival of certain genetic variants. Okay? And in order to understand that, you really have to have a good model of genetics. Darwin didn't have a good model of genetics. He really didn't. And it's sort of one of the great tragedies in the history of science. 1859, 1866, Mendel's publications. But Darwin wouldn't have understood them if he did read them. 2 hated reading German, and 3 probably didn't have access to them. So that marriage never happened. But, I mean, what's happened since? Man, we've moved into the genomic era, and that's one of the things I want to talk about. And with that, we now really understand, I still think is the most remarkable thing in all of biology, which is the transformation of a single cell, a fertilized zygote, an egg meets sperm, into you. 50 trillion cells? It's extraordinary. And there's just a string of information. It's that genome that drives that process. Cell division after cell division after cell division, and you've got this amazingly choreographed, beautifully orchestrated organism that is you. And we actually have a pretty good idea in the basics, at least, certainly the early phases of that, how that works. This kept poor Darwin awake at night. No wonder he looked so traumatized. Social insects, bees, ants, wasps, they do this weird thing, and it's a no-no in Darwin land, okay? A worker bee is sterile. She does not reproduce. Now think about the logic of natural selection. As I say, it's about passing your variants, your genetic variants, onto the next generation. So this, we call it reproductive altruism, where you forego altruism in order to help your ma, the queen of the colony, produce more offspring, right? That is lunacy in sort of simple Darwinian thought. And Darwin felt that way. I mean, literally, he tossed and turned thinking about these things. And it wasn't until the 60s that we really got a good idea about how it works, which is, it turns out there are two ways I can pass my genetic variants, my genes, on to the next generation. I can reproduce myself and have my own children, fine, or I can help my sister, let's say, have many children. Okay? And because my sister's closely related to me, I'm effectively producing more of my own genes through her. So it's the indirect route, which basically, and it's a sort of back of the envelope calculus. If she has that many children and I help her raise them, that's arguably better than me having my own. And that's what ants are doing. It's, again, about, they don't do the calculus, they've evolved for the calculus, that as a worker ant, it's actually more profitable evolutionarily in terms of my representation in the next generation to produce more sisters, more workers, i.e. to help mum, than it is for me to have my own offspring. Okay? That wasn't until the 60s that we really figured that out. This is a biggie, speciation. Now, this is probably not something you think about all the time, but it's an incredibly important part of the evolutionary process. You all know about natural selection. Natural selection is the thing where you've got zebras, and here's the sad, slow zebra at the rear of the herd, and there's the lion. Genes removed from the population. That's natural selection, okay? They're a heartless lot in Kansas, aren't they? Stupid zebra. That's part of it. And so that's what that is, you know, that's evolving, ultimately, faster zebras. But imagine a world where there was no speciation. What is speciation? Speciation is where you have one species that somehow splits into two. So if this process didn't happen, the splitting process, you have the origin of life 3.9 billion years ago. You've got some wiggly little molecules which are self-replicating. Natural selections go operate. The wiggly molecules that do the best job in terms of harvesting the resources and replicating themselves would do better than the other ones. That's natural selection. And it would get better and better and better and better and better and better. And the whole planet would eventually be overrun by a single, probably rather multi-purpose microbe. End of story, right? It's critical, this process of splitting, this speciation business. Darwin didn't understand it. We do now. It's super simple. We could do it, I'll do an experiment with this crowd. Be patient. I'm going to build a wall down the middle of the room here. I'm going to have to, with all due respect to the baptismal font or whatever that is there. So I'm going to put a wall here. Now we've got basically genetically identical population on either side, okay? Okay? I'm going to build a wall and I'm going to provide both sides with everything they need. Okay, there's going to be, you know, yogurt and breakfast cereal, Wi-Fi, okay? And there's no communication between the two of you, okay? There are two sides. And I'm going to leave you here for 500,000 years or something. Now, obviously, it's going to get boring. It's a bit like Logan on a Thursday afternoon. What's going to happen? Well, genetic differences are going to arise between the two populations, okay? So this gentleman with the blue tie in the front, a mutation occurs in him. Yes, sorry. Mr. Mutant. Now, and maybe by chance, that'll, over the generations, increase in frequency in this population. It's not going to be in that population, right? Because of the wall, okay? And a different mutation arises here, and a different one here, and a different one here, and so on and so forth. This is going to take a long time. Okay? What does that mean? That over time, this population is slowly becoming more genetically distinct from this population. Okay? Now, Think of that process I described of development, where you have a sperm and an egg, and those two strings of genetic information, remember this is just A, G, 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 C, 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 T, G, 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 C, C, etc., okay? They have to come together and collaborate to build the extraordinary complex thing that you are. Now imagine the sperm and egg, because we've waited 500,000 years and we've taken a lucky female descendant on this side and a lucky male descendant from this side, and we've taken them to a motel room. The sperm and egg genomes are quite different now because of that mutation process, and that may be sufficiently different that they can no longer collaborate to produce the complex organism that they can do within population, but not between populations. That's speciation. It's that simple. Darwin didn't get it. Darwin, as we'll see, was averse to talking about human evolution for all sorts of reasons. It's a bit of a hot-button topic. He felt it was too incendiary. He virtually knew nothing about the fossil record, which is tragic, actually. He was sort of defensive about the fossil record. He felt that it was so gappy, it didn't, there were all sorts of problems with it. Actually, it's just this glorious document supporting virtually everything he said. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about humans, because I'm going to leave that. That's going to what I'm going to do finally, because you can all relate to humans. But I also want to talk about genomics. So those are the two of these, this plethora of things that I've selected. But just to remind you, what we're talking about, now call me biased. I'm an evolutionary biologist. This is biology's best idea. Well, actually, no, I think this is the best idea. Full stop, actually. I think the bicycle comes close. No, but this is a weird thing to do in somewhere as landlocked as Kansas City. But I think the weird wackiness of sea slugs best enshrine biological diversity. I just think they're just ridiculous. They're just amazing things. No, this super simple idea, which a middle schooler can understand, this is not rocket science, explains where biological diversity comes from. It explains why and how biological diversity is so perfectly tailored for its environment. The hummingbird has the bill perfectly proportioned to probe to the base of the flower. That's natural selection, right? So those are two biggies. Perhaps the biggest biggie is this simple idea. Descent, descent, descent from a common ancestor. Modification through natural selection. Occasional speciation events. Explains us. If you're a philosopher, you're interested in mind. Yeah, and maybe you could say that's the sort of highest calling of a human being, to really try to grapple with our identities. That mind is the product of brain. That brain evolved on the plains of Africa. It's an evolutionary process that gave us, ultimately, William Shakespeare. Now, for a simple idea, that's a pretty good threefer, I have to say. There's a great story. Darwin was a sort of plodding, well, big beardy, as you know. If you were sitting next to him at dinner, it wouldn't be sort of cut, thrust, and parry. He wouldn't be super zippy. He'd be nice, but not zippy. The person who'd be zippy would be Thomas Henry Huxley. He was famously... So Darwin didn't do much of his own defending. He left that to his sort of his henchmen. And this guy, Huxley, was super sharp. He was known as Darwin's bulldog. Huxley would, if somebody criticized Darwin, Huxley would go after him and eat him. But I love that Huxley read The Origin of the Species and he had a sort of Homer Simpson moment. How extremely stupid not have thought of that. I mean, it's so bloody obvious. So that's my point. We've got this elegant, super simple, not rocket science-y idea, which, as I say, 158 years has remained wonderfully sound. I'm going to pull out two things to highlight about the excitement of what we're doing, we, collectively, the evolutionary biology community, are doing today. And they're sort of rather grand things. I've got, another 30 minutes, so let's do the underpinnings of biological diversity and understanding ourselves. Biological diversity. 15 years ago or so, we had the Genome Project. Huge deal, okay? So this is this enormous technical accomplishment to get all this DNA information out of a human being, okay? Now, what is extraordinary, this is really remarkable, is the technology that original what I'm going to call a mega project spawned. So this is the cost of sequencing a human genome, okay? And this was at the time that it was finished. Now, it started off, so this line is still going up here from when they started, so it was much more expensive than $100 million. And by the way, please note that this is a log scale, okay? Now, this is Moore's law. This is Gordon Moore, Mr. Intel, who has this rule of thumb for the speed at which high-tech computer technology increases, which is basically, it doubles every 2 years. Now, that's pretty damn fast, okay? Now, it's a straight line because we're on a log plot, but that is the white heat of technology, that line, okay? And for the first 8 years or so of the 21st century, DNA sequencing kind of tracked it. We were getting better at it, but there was nothing spectacular. Then, whoo, whole bunch of really amazing new technologies, sort of collectively known as next-generation sequencing, hit about here, such that today we're pretty much there, the $1,000 genome. Okay, which means, by the way, I don't know how much does an MRI cost? Okay, which means this is rapidly going to be part of your medical record. Okay, now, but I don't care about that. I'm not interested in medicine. That's your problem. I'm interested in this because what this means is okay, fine, we got the human genome sequence. We can start exploring human medical problems and so on. That's obviously important and cool. But from my point of view as an evolutionary biologist, it means that we can now do sequence genomes of lots of other species. So this is the field of comparative genomics. This is just to give you a flavor of it. This is a sequence of a particular, it doesn't matter what the gene is, and this is actually, it's not the ATGCs of DNA. This is actually the protein that comes from the gene. And so you've got 20 different amino acids make up the protein, and this is actually the one-letter code for the different amino acids. Details completely unimportant. What I want you to see is this is basically across mammals: cows, chimpanzees, humans, hamsters. Why hamsters get a look in? Somebody had a pet, clearly. Mouse, rat. Now, that's a lot of evolution. The common ancestor of those things existed about 75 million years ago. So that was 75 million years ago, and then you've got the hamster going down there, and you've also got other rodents, so the mouse and the rat, but you've got humans and chimps going off over here, and we've got cows going off over here. So it's not just 75 million years of evolution, it's 75 plus 75 plus probably another 40, it's hundreds of millions of years of evolution. And what's happened, look at this block. It's been kept exactly the same. So how's that happened? Well, plenty of mutations have occurred in that time on those different lineages that have changed these things. What happens to those individuals? It's like the sad, chubby zebra that you so mocked, okay? That's natural selection thinning the herd, so to speak. But natural selection is stunningly precise. And what's more, and this is the message, natural selection tends to keep things the same. Once something has arisen way back when in evolution, if you like, natural selection has figured out how to solve a biological problem, what happens? You keep it that way, okay? And so, look, I find this stunning. This is a nematode worm. This common ancestor between this young lady and this worm is on the order of more than 500 million years ago. So that's a billion years of evolution, because there's the common ancestor, 500 million to humans, 500 million to the worm, and yet we're still about 50%. This thing is incredibly simple. It has 959 cells. Never 960, never 950, always 959. And yet we're still 50%, our proteins are 50% similar. You can make this is even weirder. This is one of my favorite experiments. I work on fruit flies. In fruit flies, we have great names for our genes, and they're sort of obvious names. There was a mutation we found that caused fruit flies not to have eyes, so we called it eyeless. Clever. The mammal people found a mutation that causes mice, and all mammals, in fact, not to have eyes. They called it PAX6. I don't know what that's about. Anyway, it turns out, and this is amazing, it's the same gene, okay? This is a gene that early in development says build an eye here. What you can do is you can take a fruit fly, which has no working eyeless gene, so it's going to be blind. It's going to have no eyes. There's no instruction saying build an eye. And you can take the gene out of the mouse, which, as I say, is 1 billion years of evolution apart, give or take. Stick that in the fruit fly, and the fruit fly gets eyes. Okay? Now, that's especially amazing. This isn't a mouse eye, but it's close enough. When you consider we're dealing with completely different eyes. So this is the basic signal, says build an eye here, and it's conserved. It's essentially identical between fruit flies, humans, and mice. Okay? So what does this mean? It means that most of evolution is about keeping things the same. Okay? Which is a bit puzzling when you look around, when you look at sea slugs, right? And you see all this diversity. So how can we this is a problem of the genomic age. How can we reconcile all this conservation, this natural selective mediated conservation, with the biological diversity we see around us? And this is perhaps best enshrined by an experiment we did. This is artificial selection, so it's a bit of a cheat, but it's amazing. About 12,000 years ago, we took one of these babies, a wolf, and domesticated it. And then all sorts of weird people over the years says, I want a really big, loopy wolf descendant, or I want something that looks like an unfortunate baby. No, I'm serious. I mean, look what we've done. And these things are almost genetically identical to each other. They're all just recently derived from wolves, right? And yet, they're crazy different. So what this is telling us is there's this process whereby you can leverage small genetic differences which have very significant, if you like, downstream consequences in terms of the behavior, anatomy, and physiology of the organism we're dealing with. So and this is the study, it's unfortunately named, this is where development comes in. There's this study of Evo Devo, which sounds like a sort of late 80s synthesizer band or something. But it turns out it's development which is a key player here. I'm going to give you 2 ways in which development can do this. Tiny changes in a genome have massive downstream consequences. The first piece is the obvious one. Turns out development is a hierarchical switching process. Think what I just told you about the eye. So there is a gene that says build an eye here, and then that recruits a whole bunch of other genes which actually do the construction, if you like. And that itself is a hierarchical process. Obviously, you're going to lay out the outline. It's just like building something, right? You're going to lay out the outline of the eye, and then you're going to recruit more genes which actually fill in, so to speak. So once you've got a hierarchical process, if you tweak something high up in that cascade, okay, that's going to have really significant consequences. If you go right down at the bottom of the cascade, that's not going to probably change very much. You might change the color of the eye, but if we tweak something up here, it's eye or no eye, okay? So it's that hierarchical switching process that allows us to make small changes have major consequences. This is one of the most famous, well, no, it is the most famous fruit fly mutant in the world. It's amazing. This, if you, like me, you've spent many years of your life staring fondly down a microscope at fruit fly faces, this is like, your sister's baby picture, for me. I mean, there's its eyes, there's its antennae, and this is its little its labial lips. These are its kisser. It's feeding apparatus. So that's a normal fruit fly face. This is an abnormal fruit fly face. This has the eyes, has the mouth. It doesn't have any antennae. Instead of antennae, it has legs coming out here, fully formed legs. This is a single base pair mutation in DNA. It's a trivial change, but what has happened is you've confused the geography of the embryo. So there should be a signal in the thorax, in the middle part of the body, that says build legs here. There should be a signal at the front of the head that says build antennae here. You just switch that, just tiny change, and you've got legs coming out of your head. And again, perfectly formed legs, so that the whole recruitment has worked. It just is, inconvenient. And there are other ones, by the way. This is what a normal fruit fly looks like. It's a dipteran, which means it has two wings. It has these funny little things, actually stabilizing organs called halteres here. This is a not-so-normal fly, where instead of having this, you've got a second set of wings. Now, you don't have to be a genius to imagine how this could have been important in the evolution of insects, right? Because wing number is something that can change, and we can change it in the lab rather simply. So that's number one, this hierarchical idea. The second idea is algorithmic. Now, think about, again, let's go back to that sperm-egg moment. And that sperm egg is going to divide 2, 4, 8, 16. And it's going to do that an awful lot, because as I say, there's several tens of trillions of cells in each one of you, okay? And it turns out that there's sort of rules, fate rules we call them, which determine what these dividing cells are going to be. And this is a notional idea, but I just want to give you the power of this kind of thinking. So here is a set of rules, which is if you've got a row in the parent row of 3 blacks, you have a black in the middle, and if you've got 2 blacks and a white, you get a black, and so on and so forth. If you've got 3 whites, you put a white underneath, okay? So let's run this rule, okay? Now that's kind of boring, but you've produced structure from this very simple set of rules, okay? Let's change these just ever so slightly. We're also going to have 8 rules, and these are super simple rules. So here's a slightly different set of rules. Now let's run it. Whoa. Isn't that pretty? That's with the second set of simple rules, third set. So, again, slightly different. What do we get now? Now we get something which is formally chaotic. There's no pattern at all, and it's not repeating. Okay? So, look, I'm not going to go too much to town on this. The point is that given the fact you've got this iterative process, you tweak those rules just a tiny little bit, you've got all sorts of potential for generating all sorts of major downstream difference. So that, very briefly, is what I have to say on how we can reconcile this problem that natural selection keeps genomes the same on average because it's preserving the things that work, and yet you've got all this diversity when we look around the natural world. Let's move now to ourselves, to human beings. As the energy in the room begins to sag, people regretting that second whiskey and soda. So here's the origin of species, 1859. And look, all the famous debates about the origin of species were about one key issue. Is it really true that us, wonderful humans, are modified great apes? This is what I mean. This is a pretty seismic idea. Created in the image of God or modified great ape. That's a biggie. Now, I'm sorry to say that Charles Darwin, M.A., wimped out. He was probably astute. He realized he's playing with fire anyway. Remember, this is heresy, what he's doing in the first place. So he decides, even though it's the thing that everyone's most interested in, he decides to sort of tiptoe past the issue. This is the most he has to say about human evolution in The Origin of Species. Much light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. Great, Charles. Now, And this was, as I say, this is strategic on his part. 12 years later, he wrote a big book, The Descent of Man, about human evolution. And by the way, he was it's not like he was confused or anything. In fact, I think the most underrated moment in the Darwin story is this one. I mean, we all think of Darwin in the Galapagos. He's on the prow of the Beagle and the wind's rippling in his sideburns. As the Beagle plunges forward, he leaps into the surf, and there are finches hopping around with the different sized bills, and slow-mo eureka moment. I mean, that's our sort of perception of him. It was completely wrong, by the way. He didn't get the finches at all. But this, I think, is really amazing, actually. So because he's just got back from the voyage of the Beagle, he's still in a state of ferment. He's sort of developing his ideas, but he hasn't got any ideas yet. And he's not seen any great apes, by the way, on his travels. But for the first time in London, there is a living great ape, which is a juvenile orang, Jenny. And because he's a gentleman scientist, he actually can go and hang out in the cage with Jenny. And you cannot have a close encounter with a great ape and come away with any idea other than the fact that there is extraordinary proximity, whatever that is, between us and them. So I'm just going to show, I think this is a beautiful movie clip. This is an awful movie called Creation, and it was about Darwin's anxieties and so on. But they were just, I think, incredibly lucky when they filmed. Darwin was actually completely on board with human evolution, and he actually understood something in a rather sophisticated way. He understood that humans must have evolved in Africa, as he recognized on anatomical grounds that gorillas and chimpanzees, our closest relatives, are both in Africa. So sort of by default, we must come from Africa ourselves. Now, I'm not going to, we now, of course, he had none of this. We now have this amazing fossil record. It's absolutely stunning of what has happened in the about 7 million years since our lineage split off from chimpanzees. And these are hard-won fossils. You know, these generations of graduate students have spent their lives on their knees, shuffling through dirt in really hot and obscure parts of North Africa looking for these specimens. And several of them, you know, only 1 in 12 get one. And that's your PhD, mate. I'm not going to talk about these, though they are fantastic. I'm a geneticist. So I want to talk about the genetic approaches we brought to bear to human evolution. And you'll be familiar with many of the broad results, but I'm going to skip over them. So here's the common ancestor of us and chimpanzees. There's 2 species of chimpanzees, as you know. Here are our ancestors. And it's important to appreciate, and that's where the fossils come in. There's lots of bushy branching here. It's always a problem. Who do we use to be the canonical, the archetypal human being? I'm tempted, obviously, to use myself. But no, this is a Harvard Alumni Association sponsored event. So here's Drew Faust, president of my university. I hope you're watching the live stream, Dr. Faust, yes. Now, so it all happened in Africa over 7 million years. And then about 1.8, the first out of Africa group was a species called Homo erectus that left about 1.8 million years ago, moved into Europe and Asia. So you've now got hominins, as they're called, our relatives, out of Africa. Then there was a second out of Africa event, which gave about 500,000 years ago, which gave rise to the Neanderthals. They went to Europe and Western Asia, okay? What about us? Well, this is our family tree passed into Africans and non-Africans. This is fortunately not on the test. I'll give you the simple version. The simple version is actually really remarkable. This famous study from 1987, that our species arose very recently in Africa, and 2, non-Africans are just one branch from within the African family tree. So this is the common ancestor of all humans, and both branches are African, then you've just got this group of Africans who headed out of Africa. Okay, now that's the so-called out of Africa idea, you're all familiar with it. But more interesting, we've got modern humans leaving Africa 70,000 years ago. These guys were still around. Okay, so what happened? Well, we, as you know, and again, you've seen versions of this, I'm sure, it's an extraordinary story. The diaspora of our species moving out of Africa and colonizing the world. And I mean, as you know, very late into the Americas, maybe 17,000 years ago, incredibly late. But the most remarkable part of this story, I think, is this: Madagascar. Madagascar is right next door to where all the action is. Okay, so you would have thought, and it's this fantastically fertile piece of tropical real estate, you would have thought it would have been sort of part of the action rather early on in the piece. The first humans to get to Madagascar got there about 2,000 years ago, and they came from Southeast Asia. So the original language group in Madagascar is Bahasa Malay, basically. Anyway, there's that. But what happened when our ancestors came out and met the folk already there, the Neanderthals? Was it something like this? Probably not. But we definitely overlap with them. And so it was this question: did we kill them? Did we beat them up? What happened to them? Okay, and it's difficult to know, right? I mean, this is the anatomical difference. These guys, just much heavier boned, adapted to a northern climate, and by the way, bigger brains than us. Swept back, they were sort of pre-adapted for doing one of those downhill sledding events in the Winter Olympics. But anatomy won't get you very far, and I'm a geneticist. What's exciting, and what I'm going to spend the next 5 or 10 minutes talking about, the final 5 or 10 minutes about talking about, is ancient DNA. We now have the technology. I sound like what was he called? $6 million man. We now have the technology to take DNA from a 30,000-year-old Neanderthal bone and analyze it just as we would your DNA. Okay, and this is really recent, so it's super tricky. But this is 2010. We had 2 studies of ancient DNA. 2011, still not much. 2012, just getting up there. 2013, a few more. Getting better. 2015, whoa. So this is a major, so this is the latest, this is a major growth industry. And we're just getting all this extraordinary information. And it's all super, super recent. And the first thing, and you already all know this, and I think it's stunning, and this was from the original study, 2010, we now know that everyone in this room who is not a pure African is part Neanderthal. Okay? So, and it turns out that people in Europe are about as much Neanderthal as people in Asia, as people in New Guinea or Australia. Okay? So what does that suggest? It suggests that what happened here, sort of when our ancestors were first coming out, and then you have, if you like, the injection of Neanderthal material, and then it's spread around. But the really cool thing is it's not only Neanderthals. It turns out that Neanderthals had a close relative known as the Denisovans from this cave. The only thing we know about these things, we know quite a lot about Neanderthals, by the way. We know they were smart. We know they had culture. They did ritual burials and so on. This is something we know. We have a pinky bone and a tooth. And it's a species related to Neanderthals, but really quite different from Neanderthals. So we call those Denisovans. And what we have now is this absolutely reformed vision of human evolution. So previously, we've kind of thought of those 7 million years as this sort of march, and brains are getting bigger, and we're getting more bipedal, and we're ever getting more human. There's sort of the drive to Homo sapiens, right? Now it turns out that, yes, of course, there's all sorts of interesting evolutionary things going on, but then there's smutty acts in dark corners of the Middle East Neanderthals, and then somebody's having sex with a Denisovan. We're like village dogs, curs, mutts, when there's something pure and pristine and beautiful about us. So this is the main line of human evolution in Africa. And then you have the group that went out, these are the Neanderthals leaving Africa and becoming the Neanderthals, and splitting off and producing the Denisovans, okay? And then here's African moderns, and the out of Africa event, which led to modern Europeans, Asians, and Oceanians, and you've got all this interbreeding. 2% of your genome is Neanderthal, on average, okay? Now, God, this is not a good slide to introduce at the late phase of an evening talk, but Genetics 101, you loved it. I just want to remind you of a little bit of genetics, that when you have chromosomes from mum and dad, when you're making gametes, when you're making sperm and eggs, they exchange material, okay? So in other words, the chromosome the chromosome 2 that I passed on to my daughter Megan, okay, is a mix of the chromosome 2 I received one chromosome 2 from my mother and one chromosome 2 from my father. And then they've done this weird thing where they've swapped segments. So Megan has a unique chromosome 2, which is a sort of hybrid of my parents' chromosome 2. Okay? Why am I telling you this? This is really cool. So let's travel back in time where we've got, these are the chromosomes, let's say this is chromosome 2. So, and we've got two copies of each. This is a chromosome from your mother and one from your father. And this is the Neanderthal, and here's a modern. So we're just color coding it. So we're going to do the cross. This is genetics. And so the first generation, you've got a pure Neanderthal chromosome and a pure modern chromosome. But now what's going to happen? Let's have this individual breed with another modern, okay? So that's another pure blue one, okay? But we're going to have that recombination process occurring here, okay? Now, we're going to do that. Now that's what we've got, okay? Don't take notes. This is going to keep going, okay? So we're going to have another cycle of this. We're going to have another cross. And now the point is, if we keep crossing to the blue, we're going to break up these pieces of red every generation, right, into ever smaller islands of Neanderthal DNA in the genome, okay? So actually, we can look at this over several generations. Here it is. So this is the first hybrid child, then there's the grandchild and the great-grandchild. And all I want you to get is as the generations roll by, getting overexcited. As the generations roll by, so the islands of redness get smaller, okay? Which is why, if we look at, this is, I think, 12 genomes of, 15 non-Africans, looking at their entire genome. So this is Australian B2, and black is clearly modern Homo sapiens sequence. And then you see these tiny islands, yellow and blue are tiny islands of Neanderthal DNA. So it's exactly what I described. You do this process for enough generations, and you're going to break this up into tiny little islands. And that's what your genome has. It has lots of tiny little islands of Neanderthal DNA. Now, this is the cool thing. This paper where we found, this is ancient DNA gain from a modern human who's 45,000 years old. Okay? Here's the materials fished out of a riverbank in Siberia somewhere. What I'm going to do is add that individual. Now, remember, this hybridization occurred maybe 70,000 years ago when we first came out of Africa. These people are all today, so there's been lots of chances for those blocks to get made smaller and smaller and smaller. Let's see what our friend from 45,000 years ago has. Whoa. So he's got a few small bits, but he's got some big ones as well. So the size of those blocks are an indirect indicator of how many generations have elapsed, lots of generations here, rather few generations between the moment of hybridization and taking this data, okay? So that's the pattern we have. And we can actually, from this, we can date the hybridization from the size of these chunks of DNA. That's what we have, but what about your 2%? What does it do? Is it important or is it irrelevant? This is kind of cool. This is somebody who's gone, looked at 1,004. I don't know why they did the extra 4. They went, so it could be everyone in this room, they sequence the DNA and identify everyone's Neanderthal bits. Okay? So what do we find? So here's the Neanderthal genome. We find if we look across all those 1,000 people, there's a fair bit of the Neanderthal genome which is missing. Okay? Now that's probably natural selection. That's not useful DNA. Okay? So natural selection's got rid of that. Now, if we look at my genome, okay, so there's my 2%. And let's take Mr. Blue Tie here again, mutant man. That's his genome. Okay? So there's some overlap here, but in terms of our Neanderthal DNA, but he's got his own little bit of Neanderthal DNA, and I've got my own little bit of Neanderthal DNA. The cool thing is this stuff. There's some missing, and there's some which is at sort of unexpectedly high frequencies. It's almost in everyone. What does that suggest? I'd say this stuff has been eliminated by natural selection. This stuff has been boosted by natural selection. So what this hybridization has done, it's allowed what I call genetic cherry picking. Now think about it. Neanderthals came out of Africa, moved into Europe 500,000 years ago. Then natural selection's done its job. It's turned them from very dark-skinned into light-skinned. You want to be fair-skinned in the north, or you get vitamin-related problems. Okay? Over those years, those Neanderthals have evolved to cope with the diseases you have in the north that you don't have in the south, and so on. So that's a lot of natural selection. Okay? What we get by breeding with a Neanderthal, we get a cassette of ready-made for Europe adaptations. Okay? It's actually really cool. So this is all really recent stuff. Immune and pigmentation traits. These are the things that our species has cherry-picked from the Neanderthals. So we really are hybrids. And I'll give you a final example because it's a beautiful example and it's really well worked out. Tibetans. Tibetans are adapted genetically to life at super high altitude. Okay? They just cope better than you do. You're staggering around gasping and turning blue. They're just fine. And it turns out, and you can do the genetic studies, it turns out there's a particular gene that is associated with that. And Tibetans have a very different version of the gene than you do, or even the populations Han Chinese in the vicinity. So there's something peculiar, and that sort of makes sense. They're adapted to this very unusual environment, so you'd expect them to have an unusual gene. The really amazing thing is that their unusual gene, and this is complicated, I appreciate, these are people, each line is people, and this is a chunk of DNA sequence. And basically black is a difference. What I want you to see is one, that Tibetans as a whole are rather different from Chinese, okay? The really cool thing is, and really quite different from Chinese, the cool thing is that Tibetans are very similar to the Denisovans. So in other words, Tibetans got their ability to cope with high altitude from Denisovans, okay? Again, it's more of this fantastic, complex admixture, this we're mutts, we're curs, we're mongrels. So, and Darwin, this is the final paragraph of his book on human evolution. I think he said it beautifully. We must acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man, with all his noble qualities, with sympathy which feels for the most debased, with benevolence which extends not only to other men, but to the humblest living creature, with his godlike intellect which has penetrated into the movements and constitution of the solar system, with all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. And I do think if he was sitting at the back, and maybe he is, Darwin would be absolutely thrilled by these latest developments. It's added whole new dimensions to his ideas. These are things he couldn't even conceive of. But they fit in exquisitely, powerfully, and beautifully into his simple, not rocket science idea of 1859. Thank you very much.
All right, we have time for a few questions. Raise your hands. I'll come by with a microphone. We want to get the audio on our live stream feed. Just hold it close to your mouth.
Thank you. Question. With respect to the Neanderthal genes, do we have any understanding yet of what those genes actually do, what their function is?
You mean the ones that are high frequency in us?
Yes. You told us about the one with the Dissolvians, but besides that one, do we have any information?
Yeah, so the Tibetans is one. The other two major sets are immune function genes, okay? And the idea here is, in Africa, you're dealing with a completely different set of diseases, essentially, than you are in Europe. The Neanderthals have spent several hundred generations adapting to those diseases. We get their evolved immune response. The other one is skin color and other pigment-related phenomena. Neanderthals probably had a more or less Irish complexion, sort of reddish appearance. We know that from DNA information. Why? It turns out, so Neanderthal ancestors were black Africans coming out of Africa, okay? And black Africans in Africa had to be black in order to protect their skin from high sunlight intensities, okay? You don't want to, and this actually, the famous cases of people, very dark-skinned people moving to northern Britain, let's say, and living in Manchester, and having all sorts of developmental problems because, for example, to synthesize certain vitamins, vitamin D in particular, you need a reasonable amount of sunlight. And if you've got very dark skin and you're living in Manchester where the sun has never shone yet, you're at a severe disadvantage. So there's natural selection in favor of a loss of pigmentation. And again, it's natural selection. It's incredibly inefficient and slow. So one individual is slightly paler, so they do slightly better than the dark individual. They have slightly more children, and so there's the better representation of that variant in the next generation, and then a few more in the following generation, and so on. It takes time, okay? But that's what happened to the Neanderthals, and it's what happened to us. So our ancestors were black when they came out of Africa. And pretty damn rapidly, 70,000 years. So and this isn't all worked out, but my money's on that we got whole cassettes of fair-skinnedness and other related traits from the Neanderthals. It's a super interesting question and definitely ongoing territory.
Professor Berry, back here in the middle of the room.
A few years back, National Geographic ran a series on the evolution of humans. One of their claims was that Africans migrated out of Africa and to the Orient, developed speech, and then went back to Africa and then shared that gene. Do you have any evidence to support that, or have you seen that?
I've not seen it. It sounds, with all due respect to National Geographic, bogus. I mean, it's one of the striking things about human evolution is Africa is really the locus where things happen. I mean, I've focused on these weird outlying events relating to Neanderthals and so on. Look, there might have been interesting two-way traffic, but anyone who claims they can nail that speech happened here then is, I would suggest, overreaching. So, no.
Professor Berry, over here on your right, we have an online question from our live stream audience. Braden wants to know, do you believe that random mutation and natural selection provide enough evidence to explain the complexity and apparent organization of life?
They don't provide evidence. Is natural selection sufficient to account for what we see? It's actually an interesting piece of history. So the answer is yes. I'm an evolutionary biologist. But there's an interesting piece of history here. Darwin advanced the idea of natural selection in 1859. And there are actually two components to the theory. One is what we'll call what Darwin called descent with modification, which is this idea you have a common ancestor, and then the next generation is slightly different, and the next generation is slightly different. So it's this sort of divergence process. And also means that everyone's related. Okay, it's easy to see that we're related to chimpanzees. We're also related to cows, let's say, but just rather further back. That's descent with modification. The second piece was natural selection, which is this it is a horribly crude process. Okay, some zebras run slightly faster than others. Okay, and they're the ones and so their fast-running genes are going to be passed on to the next generation. And there was pushback, a bit akin, I would say, to the question. So can that crude fumbling process where generation is being generated at random, and then you've got this filter, which is the lions eating the slime, is that really going to work? And people began to doubt it, because you look around, you see all this exquisite, precise design in nature. Until, and they came up with various other slightly sort of mystical ideas and so on, until basically the 1920s, that was when finally Mendel's ideas, a genetic theory, and Darwin's ideas came together. And it allowed the development of a mathematical treatment of natural selection. So, and that's the joy of math. Instead of depending upon your intuition, God, it's complex, I can't believe this fumbling process could do it, what you can do is basically extrapolate over vast periods of time. We call it integration, right? And so you can actually establish quite satisfactorily that even if you've only got tiny selective differentials, even if the slow zebra is only running half a mile an hour faster than the other zebras, that's enough over the vast periods of time that we have, and we do. 3.9 billion years is a lot of time. That's enough to produce what we see around us. Yes, sir.
Can you comment upon the lifespan of organisms and how it gets determined, as well as how the lifespan of an organism in one species compares with that of another?
That's a really interesting question. So, why do some things live a really long time and other things flicker in and out? So one is, and I think this is an interesting idea, that aging is preventable. Okay? And that's true in humans, it's true in mice, it's true in fruit flies. In a sense, it's a programmed process. Okay? Essentially, you start falling to pieces after a bit, probably after you've reproduced, and so on. Now, why is that? Because you've already reproduced. Natural selection doesn't care about you very much now you're falling to pieces. Okay? Yeah. So a bunch of mutations are kicking in and sort of taking you down, basically. Now, so in principle, if we knew what those mutations were and could manipulate them, we could prevent you from falling to pieces. Okay? There's no absolute reason. I mean, people would maybe disagree with me, but there's no absolute reason that we have to decay. So then the question is, why do we decay, one? And two, and this is your second question, why do we decay at different rates? Why do we last 80 years and mice last 3 years? Okay? The best explanation I know of this came from Sir Peter Medawar, and he talked about beer glasses, something which is close to every Englishman's heart. Now, imagine you've got 100 beer glasses in a very smart pub in the West End of London, okay? Where everyone just has a delicate little drink. Thank you, okay? Versus another cohort of glasses which is in a really rough part of town yes, they're occasionally used for drinking from, but they're largely weapons. Okay? Okay? So, think about the life expectancy, and this has nothing to do with the glass itself. It's to do with its environment. The bad neighborhood glasses have a very short life expectancy. Okay? Whereas the good neighborhood glasses have a long life expectancy. Okay? Now, we live in different environments, we do different things, okay? But that essentially transfers to the natural world. If you live in a high-risk environment, it's in your interest to develop fast, reproduce fast, live fast, die young, okay? If, however, you can control your environment or you're in a low-risk environment, then that pressure is off and you can have a longer lifespan, okay? But I do think it's a really interesting problem because I don't think it's something we'll do even in the foreseeable future, but I think we can probably prevent aging.
Professor Berry, back here on your left, towards the back of the room.
Yep.
What would you say would be the best response to the argument that various life forms have a lot of information, and information only comes from an intelligent mind, so maybe there's an intelligent designer?
Well, there might be an intelligent designer. You don't need one to account for the array of information we see in living organisms. That's not to say that somebody hasn't injected DNA information into platypuses or something. No, what I say to that is look at the history of life. We have a pretty good model. It's a difficult thing to really understand because we don't have fossils, we don't have direct evidence, but we have a pretty good model of how life originated, okay? And it's random. It's a bunch, this is chemistry becoming biology. It's a bunch of molecules that happen to get stuck together, which happen by chance to have the ability to replicate themselves. And once you've got that ability, then you've got natural selection, I've already said this, kicks in, right? Because if you've got a bunch of those molecules, the ones which are best at garnering resources in the environment, they're going to outcompete the other ones. So natural selection takes over. Now natural selection is looking after that information. Remember the slide I had of the conservation of protein sequences? That's natural selection doing its business of maintaining that information. So no, I don't think there's anything about and it is extraordinary the amount of information in you and in every other species, but I don't think there's any need to invoke non-material causes to account for it.
All right. Hang on one second. There's a question back here. You caught me off guard here.
Sorry, was I supposed to go on longer on that
I was
one?
not prepared. Just about 10 seconds longer would have been great.
No, I'm sorry.
Can you tell me where, as a geneticist, you feel like chemistry meets biology and life forms start? How far back do you go?
It's a really interesting question. It's very difficult to know. So geochemists have some really smart ways of detecting the presence of life, even though we don't have fossils of very early microbes. But it's contested. I mean, there was a paper that came out 2 months ago which claimed to push back the origin of life by a few million years. I tend to stay about 3.5, maybe up to 3.9 billion years ago. Now, so that, and as I've already described, that's the transition. Yes, we had chemistry, and there's nothing magical about this. All it is all we are, sorry people, is some really fancy high-end chemistry. And it started off super simple, namely just a string, a simple molecule that had the ability to replicate itself, okay? Now, interestingly, if you talk to the chemists, it turns out that given our models of how this might have happened, it quite possibly happened, not frequently, but it's not that unusual an event. So why then, and it's quite clear if you look at all the similarities from the simplest bacteria to you to a platypus, it's quite clear we do so many basic things in exactly the same way that we must all be descended from a single common ancestor. But it's quite possible that way back then, there were multiple experiments in life, and it just so happened that the one that we are a current instantiation of was the one that did best, that outcompeted the other ones.
All right, Professor Berry, up here on your right, and due to the time, we have time for 2 more questions. We'll take one up here, and then we have another live stream question that we'll end with.
Okay.
Well, just for the record, I want to mention that Darwin is always seen as his theories of natural selection and mutation, but what gets pushed under the carpet, and I haven't heard from you, maybe to restraints of time, is that actually one of his quotes is, "God protect me from Lamarck's nonsense." And actually, part of his life, he was agreeing with Lamarck that giraffes have a long neck because they have to reach the leaves of the trees. So just opposite of what he's famous for. Maybe you can...
Yeah, this relates to poor old Darwin had this problem with not having Mendel. So his intuition on genetics is actually a very reasonable intuition, but turns out to be wrong. He believed in something called, which we've termed retrospectively, blending inheritance. Now, blending inheritance is a tall person has children with a short person, the children tend to be somewhere in the middle. A very dark-skinned person has children with a very light-skinned person, the children are somewhere in the middle. So often it works, but if you think about it, it's a real problem. Imagine you've got a bell curve of zebra running speeds, okay? And let's just say that the zebras are appearing more or less at random, okay? And that blending inheritance rules the roost. Now, this is the fastest running zebra at this end of the bell curve. Almost certainly, that individual is going to breed with somebody over here, right? So their offspring is going to be in the middle here. So we've just lost that extreme, okay? Same even with the slows, because that on average will breed with a faster one, producing something in the middle. And it's a simple mathematical model. What will happen under blending inheritance is you lose the extremes of the distribution and everything just converges on the middle, okay? Darwin hadn't thought this through, and it was in 1867, so 8 years after the publication of The Origin, when a Scottish engineer with a wonderfully precise turn of mind, Fleming Jenkin, pointed this out. And it's a real problem, because think about what natural selection is. If genetics is always just pushing everything into the middle, so all the zebras are now sort of medium speed, when we know natural selection is supposed to be favoring the fastest running ones, but we don't have any fast running ones because they've sort of bred with the slower running ones, okay? So Darwin, I won't say panic, but he went into overdrive to come up with a theory of genetics that would save his theory. And he came up, yes, with a Lamarckian idea he called pangenesis, where and it's sort of science fiction / fantasy almost. He claimed that different bits would produce tiny little gemmules, so the bits that were most useful. So for the fastest running zebras, their legs would produce lots of fast-running gemmules which would accumulate in the zebra's gonads, and those would get passed on. So it really is inheritance of acquired characters as per Lamarck. And that's the tragedy that Darwin really should have read some German.
Professor Berry, one
Yeah.
more question, and this comes from one of our live stream viewers. This is from Christina.
Yep.
If we were to find life forms out in the universe, what qualities do you think would be universally shared?
Oh, that's really. Oh yeah, no, they'd all have English accents and be interested in evolutionary biology. So it's quite interesting. So there is this field of astrobiology, which is a sort of offshoot of evolutionary biology, and they're actually interested in the questions that the lady at the back raised, which is the transition from chemistry to biology. And the question is this: is there only a finite number of ways in which you can make complex life? So, or are there lots of different ways? If there's only one or a finite number of ways, then maybe whatever's out there, and there is stuff out there, it has to be, just statistically. There's plenty of real estate out there, plenty of chemistry going on. But the question then is, are these things going to be, you know, so alien, for want of a better term, or are they actually going to be, because there's only a finite number of ways, it's the laws of physics and chemistry have, you know, there's certain channels that you can go down. So, for example, will it be a carbon-based life form? Well, it turns out probably yes, actually. Just from the periodic table, carbon has this marvelous flexibility. You can do almost anything with it. You can put all these weird bonds, and basically, it's like a Lego block, basically. So, and the closest, and I'm not a chemist, so this is what the chemists tell me, the closest possibility would be silicon. And so you could maybe have a silicon-based life form, which has some of the same flexibility in terms of being able to create all sorts of different permutations, but it's much bigger, so it would be much more unwieldy. And we do know that we got plenty of silicon here, and that never took off here. So I think there would, I think this is really down to chemistry, there would be some commonalities. I think it would be a carbon-based life form. The astrobiologists make fairly effective arguments about the fact that water is a key solvent. Now, you say, why couldn't we